Out of curiosity, by a show of hands, how many people are familiar with that term, delegitimization of Israel? Okay, so, you know, a few of you, not everybody, which is great that you're all in the room and you're about to find out from, I think, maybe the best person who can talk to you about it. Bret Stephens writes the Wall Street Journal's Global View column on foreign affairs, which runs every Tuesday in the U.S. and is also published in the European and Asian editions of the paper. He is the deputy editorial page editor, responsible for the editorial pages of the Asian and European editions of the paper, the columnists on foreign affairs, and the Far Eastern Economic Review. Mr. Stephens was the youngest ever editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, a position he assumed at age 28. At the Post, he was responsible for the paper's news and editorial divisions. He also wrote a weekly column. In 2004, Mr. Stephens was named a young global leader by the World Economic Forum, where he's also a media fellow. Raised in Mexico City and educated at the University of Chicago and the London School of Economics, Mr. Stephens is married and has 3 children. And we are very honored to have you here tonight, and he'll be speaking to you and then taking questions at the end.
Well, thank you for that really nice introduction, which is mostly untrue, but I'll take it anyway. I have to admit that I only heard about the term BDS like in the last 6 months or so. And I was giving a speech at, I think, an APAC event, and some woman came up to me and she said, "What do you think about BDS?" And you know, I thought like maybe I'm a little behind the times. It sounded like a sex act. What do I think about BDS? Well, I don't know. You know? What do you think about BDS? I thought to myself, maybe I should go back home, suggest BDS to my wife. And, but then there would have been boycott, divestment, and sanctions in my bedroom, so it's a good thing I didn't. So that was my introduction to BDS, which is really the latest term of art for a long-standing campaign of delegitimization. Rebecca mentioned that earlier. That's been going on against Israel since even before it was created. People think that the Arab League's boycott of Israel began with the creation of the state and what they claim is the Nakba, the expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians by force. In fact, the Arab League's boycott of Israel begins several years earlier as a boycott of Jewish businesses in British Mandate Palestine. So there's a long campaign. In the 1970s, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution claiming that Zionism was a form of racism, one of the most shameful acts in the UN's history, although that's a kind of crowded, competitive field. You could spend a lot of time sort of debating what's the worst thing that the UN has done. And I just note en passant that one of the many reasons I love what's happening in Libya is to see the UN's Human Rights Commission suddenly deciding that it should suspend Libyan membership. How did Libya become a member of the UN Human Rights Commission in the first place? So at any rate, this forms part of a long-standing picture, and people who have been writing about Israel have been dealing with this campaign under one name or another for a very long time. So, you go and speak with these young people, and inevitably it's like, speeches organized by Hillel or the University Students for Israel or whatever, and then you always get some segment from a Palestinian Solidarity campaign, and, I talk to these young kids, and they are not, at least they don't think they're out to stand up for a movement that is fundamentally illiberal, fundamentally fellow traveling with some of the most totalitarian movements in the world today. They think they're acting on behalf of justice. And so I find myself engaging with them. And I think there's some utility in realizing that the BDS campaign, in terms of the people who are in it, isn't so different from, quote, progressive or very left-wing communist movements from the generation of my father and grandfather, in which the leadership of the movement stands for a certain set of things, mainly seizing power, ruining other people's lives. But most of the people who are in the campaign do so with a certain purity of motive and definitely convinced of their own purity of motive. And if you're going to deal with them, you have to deal with them on that basis. Instead of attacking their motives, you have to take what are their principles and use them, in a sense, against them, at least rhetorically, if you're going to start to win some of these people over. Now, I give tons of speeches on campuses, and I also listen to a lot of people attempting to make what they think is the best case for Israel. And generally what I find is that people who are Israel's declared, or at least self-declared spokesmen, spokeswomen, make a really lousy case. It doesn't entirely explain, or doesn't even come close to fully explaining the animus against Israel, but it certainly doesn't help either that our side is not really served well by the people who attempt or claim to speak to us, speak for us. And let me give you a few examples of what I mean by that. Why does Israel have a right to exist? Because Jews have been in that land for 3,000 years. Okay. It happens to be true. There's a mountain, literally mountains of archaeological evidence testifying to continuous Jewish presence in the land for over 3,000 years. It's absolutely important for those of us, why are we in Israel? Why are Jews in Israel as opposed to Uganda or Sitka, Alaska? It's because there's a connection to that particular piece of land. That's important. But it's also worth noting that there's a long-standing Palestinian connection to that piece of land. And there are long-standing connections on the part of all kinds of groups. I mean, there's a Crusader connection, a Christian connection going back to the 11th century. When you start to make the purely ethnic or purely Jewish case for why Israel has a right to exist, you kind of run into an immediate roadblock, because then your opponents say, well, what about the other people who are there? Don't they have a right? And then you're sort of faced rhetorically with two choices. One of them is to say, yes, but we have a greater right because we were there, presumably, before, which is difficult to prove and in any case irrelevant. And the other choice is to say, well, yes, I guess we both have rights to the land, and therefore we should share them. Now, that's also perfectly fine, and in a sense I agree with that. But from the standpoint of rhetoric, the best that argument gets you, the furthest that argument gets you, is to a position of stalemate. We have rights, you have rights. Let's find a way to divide those rights. Okay, so that doesn't get you very far. The next argument that I come across all the time, and which drives me bananas, is that Israelis are more victimized than Palestinians. So during the last war over Gaza in 2009, you had a lot of Jews going and saying, look at what's happening in Sderot. Constant rocket attacks in Sderot. And it's true. I mean, it was unbelievable, the level of misery that was inflicted on this little village at the edges of Gaza. But if you finally look at the raw numbers, again, the Palestinians come back and say, well, look, in this war, Palestinian rockets killed, I don't know, a dozen Israelis, and yet Israeli bombs killed hundreds of Palestinians. And when you sort of look at it in that sort of simple mathematical equation, the Palestinians always come out winners in the game of victimization. Now, that bothers me on a whole number of levels, not the least of which is I don't think that Israel wants to make its case constantly on the grounds that it is the more victimized nation. What should Israel do? Sustain greater casualties so that it can win that particular argument? That's an insane argument. But the point isn't really ultimately about who is being more victimized, at least numerically. Again, that is a complete dead end. By the way, I should mention just in passing that when I was editor of the Jerusalem Post, you saw these figures. 1,000 Israelis killed in the Intifada versus 3,000 Palestinians killed in the Intifada. And I asked an Arab member of my staff to go through a list of every single Palestinian who had been killed and check off the names of those Palestinians who were women. I was just curious, and including those names which go either way. So I was generous with these assumptions. And I found out that something that was really quite remarkable. Of all the Palestinians killed, and these were names I'd gotten from a Palestinian source, the JMCC, of all the Palestinians who had been allegedly killed by Israeli fire, 2% of those people were women. But of all the Israelis killed, the number was well in excess of a quarter. Now, if Israelis were firing indiscriminately at Palestinians, right, just bombing from the air, not caring what the target is, you would expect some ratio that was much closer to a 50-50 ratio, commensurate with the natural population. How is it that the Israeli army, which is allegedly firing indiscriminately at Palestinians, only manages to hit women 2% of the time? Anyway, that's another story. But the argument, by argument via victimization is a terrible argument. Israel didn't come into this into existence to be the most victimized nation in the world, and it's one that people shouldn't make. Another argument that people often trot out, which again drives me bananas because it's such a dead end, is, well, Israel is a democracy, right? Israel is a democracy surrounded by dictatorships. And in fact, Israel is a democracy surrounded by dictatorships, except the Palestinians held an election in 2005 and 2006. And it happens that they elected, well, first they elected Abu Mazen, who's now run beyond his term, but then they elected Hamas. So you actually don't have a case, at least on the surface, of one democratic Israel versus a sea of dictatorships. You have two democracies. Now, democracy doesn't get you very far in an argument, because when you start making the case from the standpoint of democracy, you have to say, well, what are the values that inform that democracy? Hitler was also elected democratically. All kinds of bad people are elected democratically. And as a matter of fact, one of the justifications that Hamas uses for perpetrating terror attacks on Israeli civilians is they say that because Israel elected these governments, the Israeli citizenry is just as responsible for the actions of the government as the government itself. So the argument from democracy is a very problematic argument in a whole number of ways. And it's one, by the way, that's going to work even less well if we start to see, say, an Egypt under a democratically elected Muslim Brotherhood, or a Jordan, or in Lebanon, Hezbollah, which has made huge democratic inroads. So making this argument from the standpoint of democracy is a really bad case. Another mistake that pro-Israel spokesmen make is to say Israel is just a fantastic country, and just to defend everything that Israel does. It's just, a totally superlative country. Now, I love Israel. I just returned from Israel yesterday afternoon. Every time I go back there, I feel fantastic and great. But Israel is a country that's composed of ordinary mortals, some of whom are jerks. And that goes for young men in the army. Israel is not a country that doesn't have a single pimple on it. It's not. And when you start to defend Israel that way by sort of pointing to all of its virtues, you're painting a picture of a country that doesn't actually exist. That's not to say that you can't be proud of the country for producing all kinds of things that are remarkable and amazing and wonderful, but it's a dangerous argument to engage in, because you come out sounding effectively like a naive person, and you also come out sounding out of tune with a lot of Israelis who, the moment you go there, will be the first to tell you that the government is dysfunctional, the former president was a rapist, the former prime minister is an indicted shyster. Just go down the list, and you get it also from B'Tselem and all these Israeli human rights groups. The Israeli army has done this, the settlers have done that, and so forth and so on. So that's a bad argument, to make. And the final argument that drives me insane is, when there's let's say there's a terrorist attack in Tel Aviv. When I lived in Israel, there were terrorist attacks literally three times a week, 4 or 5 of them in about a 200-yard, 300-yard radius of my apartment. And you'd have this situation in which there'd be a terrorist attack, and CNN would go to a screen, and they'd ask the Israeli spokesman, Ranan Gisin or Alon Pinkas or whoever, they'd say, "What do you make of this, Mr. Spokesman?" And he'd say, "Well, this just shows that the Palestinians, continue to commit terrorism. And as we all know, terrorism is very bad." Right? Yeah. And the Palestinian guy would say, "We condemn the violence on all sides, but you're still stealing our land." Now, every time that happened, the Palestinian won the argument, because you had an asymmetric argument. You had an Israeli guy who was talking about means, and then you had a Palestinian guy who was talking about ends. When you have that asymmetry, the proverbial man from Mars is always going to side with the person talking about ends. Because with the Palestinian, the power of the Palestinian case is to say, you have been sitting